honored to welcome our speaker series, Justin Farmer, who will show us a demonstration on Southern California Native American basketry. Justin Farmer is an Ipai basket weaver, collector, scholar, cultural activist, and author. He has spent over 3 decades conducting extensive research on cradles in Native California and Western Great Basin. Farmer has documented the cradle making characteristics of 26 tribes in 2002. He sold his large collection of 215 mission baskets, 1,000 pieces of primary Southern California artifacts, and started the Justin Farmer Foundation. The foundation offers grants to Indian students doing research on local Indian arts, artifacts, culture, and history. So without further ado, I'm honored to present Mr. Justin Farmer.
I had a collection of Indian baskets and a museum when I still had an office. I had a consulting engineering office, and then I had about, I think there were 215 mission baskets. And when I retired, I sold that collection to the Pechanga tribe. So the baskets, and there were maybe 1,000 artifacts and 100 pieces of pottery. So with that money, I created the Justin Farmer Foundation, and the purpose of the foundation was to help Indian people promulgate their culture. So I set up the foundation, and we sent 2 people to Spain, to Madrid, to film the Malaspina collection. And the Malaspina was a sea captain in the late 1700s that plied the Pacific coast, and he collected in 1793. He collected very extensively, and that collection now resides in Madrid. So I was concerned about what did Indian baskets look like before the Pope sent his people over here. My heritage goes back to my grandmother, her name was Bernardina Osuna, and she was a full-blood born at San Pasqual. She was born in 1863, quite a while ago. And she was my grandmother. Okay, and she was purchased as an infant, as a slave. The state constitution in California was adopted in 1850, and at that time, I'll go into a little detail. At that time, most of the white guys in what is now Southern California were Southerners, Kentucky and Tennessee and so forth. And those were mostly slaveholding people. And so if you wanted to be a state of the United States, and in 1850, see, there was a movement to join the United States as one of the states. Then the locals wanted California to be a slave state. Okay, but at that time, we weren't far off of 1849. And the U.S. Congress wasn't about to allow this renegade area out there that's so rich in gold to become a slave state. Okay, so so the Constitution was drafted, and they did not use the word slave, they used indenturing. Essentially, when you own a person,
That's slave.
the person is, you can generally consider the person is a slave. Okay. And my grandmother was owned. And she was owned by a Caucasian family in Oceanside.
Oh my.
And she was raised, now needless to say, she was never allowed to go to school. In fact, she was never even allowed to have a toothbrush. She could neither read nor write. But she married a man who was my grandfather, who was a cattleman. And she signed a deed to the Volcan Mountain in Julian, which is about 8,000 acres. She signed with an X. Okay, she died in 1923, and when she died, all of the schools in the backcountry closed in her honor.
Oh wow.
And every school sent a delegation to the funeral to sing.
Wow.
And here was a full-blood Indian who couldn't read or write. And she had 11 children, and and the whole purpose of indenturing was to stamp out any culture, Indian culture. And the Caucasian, the people who owned these slaves were pretty effective at that. Oh, and the Constitution was written in 1850, but it was modified in 1860, and that's when they defined how Indians were sold on the auction block. Now, most of us don't like to think of this in California, but every Monday morning there was an auction in what is now Olvera Street in LA, and Indians were sold on the market. Prior to 1769, there were no permanent non-Indian residents in the state of California. There were some Russians, who were here part-time, and there were some Iberians, but no one really was permanent here. So Indian basketry was a very common thing, that baskets were used for everything. Okay, all right, so in 1769, Junipero Serra, he and his troops came into San Diego and they established a mission. And then, and the first one was in San Diego, and then they moved up until ultimately there were 21 of them. And there was a number of reasons for that invasion. One of them is to promulgate Catholicism. One of them was to lay claim to the land in behalf of the crown. And one of them was to keep the Russians out. Well, the Russians and the Americans. Because Russia then owned Alaska, and it was coming down, and they were doing big, okay. All right, so with the missionaries, the Catholic missionaries wanted the natives to be Catholic. So you can't be Catholic and Indian at the same time in their view. So anything dealing with the native culture, any art or crafts or culture, had to be stamped out. And it didn't take very long to stamp out that culture. And baskets was one of the first things that went, because the missionaries were Iberian people, or Spanish. from Spain. And they had their own basket making. It wasn't very artistic, but it was utilitarian. They had their own pottery, and they didn't like our pottery here at all. They didn't like our clothing. They didn't like anything dealing with Indians. So anything dealing with the Indian art or craft got stamped out. And that was started in 1769. Now, it only applied to the coastal part of California. So up in the mountains, the missionary influence was minimal. So some of the cultures remained in the mountains. But along the coast, virtually all mission baskets were destroyed. Up until that time, Indian basketry was dead, as far as along the coast is concerned. There were still some of the baskets extant, but there weren't any new ones being made along the coast. Now in Northern California, yes, but of course there are different people up there. And up in the Sierras, yes, because the mission influence had not reached that far. But anyway, so in about 1835 or thereabouts, the missions were secularized, which meant that they came a part of the cedants. The land was that had been confiscated by the missions were given to whomever could grab it. The cattle were herded off by whomever could herd it off, and the Indians that were living in the mission, many of them had been born there. So they had been born and raised in the mission. They couldn't speak the language. They didn't know how to cook. They didn't know anything about their culture, but suddenly they're thrown out on the earth. Okay. Now, about this time also, the Americans were not sitting idly by watching this. John Freeman brought his people in here, workmen. There was a whole cadre of Americans who moved in. Many of them grabbed up land that was being expatriated by the missions. Most of these people were business people. So suddenly the culture, this Mexican culture of cattle and cattle hides and hides and tallow was a big thing. So suddenly we've got the United States influence, which is now a commercial type of influence. Okay, so during the late 1830s, the Americans were moving in, and a lot of these people were coming from the South. Right. So by the 1840s, the Americans pretty much had control of California. It was still a Mexican territory, but the commerce was controlled pretty much by Americans. And Americans didn't like Indians any better than the Spaniards or the Mexicans. So Indian basketry didn't fare any better under California than under the Americans. And then in the late 1840s, we had the Bear Flag Rebellion. You know, I think most of you are familiar with the Bear Flag, or are you? Okay. About a dozen ragtag guys threw the whole Mexican government out on their ear and established the California Republic. And for a short period, what is now California operated as a sovereign state. We were the California Republic. And it was controlled by Americans. Okay. But the U.S. government now could see that now California, the real rich gold area, now is controlled by white guys. So now is a good time to jump in and grab it, which they did. So in 1850 we became a state. All right. Now, and the state constitution, as I said earlier, defined in detail. And if you're interested, get a copy of that original constitution. But, the Constitution of 1850 and the Amendment of 1860. And 1860 is kind of interesting because it defines how they were sold at an auction block. Now, Indians were not citizens. So my grandmother was not a citizen, and my mother was not a citizen, and my older sister was not a citizen, and my older brother was not a citizen, and I made it by 2 years. Because I was born in 1926, and I think, when was it?
24.
24. Yeah. So, well, in fact, my older sister, my older brother, and my next older sister were not born as citizens of this. We were Indians. There were a few baskets being made inland. The Serrano people were still making a few baskets, but not very many. And the Cahuilla people, because the Cahuilla people were over on the other side, and the slave markets weren't too damn hot to go out and chase these guys down. Okay. So by about the late 1800s, and around starting 1850 or 1860, Hugo Reed was a European, and he was married to a Gabrielina woman in Pasadena, and his ranch took in pretty much that whole Pasadena area, and he wrote very extensively for the local paper, well, the local newspaper, and he wrote a daily, weekly column, and he described the French people coming into the LA Basin and hauling artifacts and basketry out by the wagon loads. And he described the wagon loads being hauled down to San Pedro and shipped to Europe.
Oh.
Okay, so by the late 1800s, then there were a few smart guys figured out, hey, if these people in Europe are that interested in our basketry, then maybe they should collect. So there were a few Indian ladies who were pretty fast on their feet, decided, well, why don't we make some pottery or some basketry? So starting in the very late 1800s, basketry creation started to come up out of the depths. And by about the turn of the century, there were a few women who were actually making Indian baskets, Southern California baskets, on a commercial basis. And the buyers who were out combing the countryside, they were wooing these ladies to And pretty soon, we had a few Indian ladies who were being commissioned to make baskets. And this is just contrary to the last 200 years. Okay, so by about the early 1900s, baskets were starting to be created and the price was starting to rise on them. And by about 1915, there was a Swiss industrialist, H. Steiner. H. Steiner paid $15,000 for a basket in 1915. It was a Datsalali basket. And when, or I'd say 1,500. I'm sorry, Datsalali was just a premier weaver. That she was a washer lady, and if she could get 1,500, well, actually, Abe Cohen, is it Abe Cohen? Yeah, Abe Cohen was her manager, and he was doing the selling, but he took her in, put her up, her and her husband up. He could see now suddenly this whole market is blossoming. So during the time of the First World War and up into the 20s was sometimes known as the Renaissance of California basketry. And baskets were starting to be created. So probably 90% of the baskets that you see today were created during that period. And as the price went up, the quality went up. And as the quality went up, the price went up. And that took place until 1929. When the bottom dropped out in 1929, people started jumping out of windows and getting their food on the soup lines, bread lines. Quite naturally, the market on the Indian baskets hit. So we don't see very many baskets that we can reliably attribute to 1930. We see a lot of them here in the 1920s, but none 1930s because of the Depression. And the Depression lasted up until about 1940. I was very fortunate. See, I was born in 26, so I was 10 years old during that Depression. But my folks, my folks owned an apple ranch. We had some cattle, and my mother had a garden that would feed half the city. So we were not hungry, but going to school, things were tough. And it was also during the middle 1930s when we had the Dust Bowl, when we had what was called the Okies moved in, and that further depressed the whole economic situation. So all in all, the 1930s were not the good old times, good old days when times were bad. So Indian basketry didn't fare very well. And this basket came up, and it was attributed to Grandma Osuna. So it started out at 800 or something like that. So 800, and there was a guy right behind me bidding. 800, 900, 1,000, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17.
What happened to your seat?
When it got to 3,000, I think I kind of slowed up because my ceiling was 250. The guy behind me, I knew him, but I didn't know he was sitting behind me, but he was buying in behalf of a museum. And he wanted her basket. Okay. So there was kind of a pause, and Ron was at 32. 1, 2, 3, sold. And he pointed this way. Well, it can be either Kathy or the one behind.
Yeah.
You know? So then he said, you know, and he says, you know, that basket that Mr. Farmer just bought was made by his grandmother. And the guy behind me said, wait a minute. He says, I was the bidder on that. No, he said, I was the bidder, and we had quite a dispute, and a lot of it had to do with just how do you point to this person and the person right behind you as an auctioneer. Okay, now, are you interested in all in the materials in the basket? Well, this basket here, this is a working basket. And it's probably from the 1930s or so. And it was probably used for either sifting or processing food. This material is sumac. And sumac is a vine. Actually, there's a number of species. It even grows into a tree. But this is a vine. And this is about what the size of the plant you use. It's only the first year growth. Okay. This material is split into 1/3, and that's what this is. And then the bark is taken off. And then it's sized down to size. And I didn't bring a sizer, but I use a coffee can lid with some holes punched in it. But and sumac is used primarily because it's tough. It's got it. Okay. Let's see. No, I don't have it. Now sumac is a half brother to poison oak. When you see it growing, poison oak growing, it'll go into clumps, kind of like wild roses. And the plant will get up so high. And poison oak and sumac look very similar. They have the same limb. They did belong to the same family, Rhus, R-H-U-S. This is Rhus trilobata. And poison oak is Rhus diversifolia. So, and you know, trilobata means 3 lobes. Diversifolia means diversified.
Yeah.
And that's how you tell the difference. And I've been using that stuff for 40 years. And one time I went into a clump to show a nephew of mine, and I was splitting it, and this has a very distinctive flavor. It has an odor and a very distinctive flavor. And I'm splitting it, and I don't taste this. And I'm wondering, why is that? And, so I got looking at it in detail, and it wasn't poison oak.
Oh, dear.
So the moral of the story is that if a guy has been doing this for 40 years, can't tell the difference. Don't you do it. But anyway, okay, so sumac is used primarily for because it's tough, it's durable. Okay. This material is the basic material here is juncus. I've referred to it as the spittoon. You see the spittoon on it? It's bellied out and it comes in and it's gonna start out. And the spittoon belt starts down around Lake Cuyamaca in San Diego County. And it runs up through it and ends. See, and then sometimes in bringing the mouth back in, then they flared it back out again. Then it became a spittoon. And you see a band in it, sometimes known as a spittoon belt, and it runs from Lake Cuyamaca up to about Hemet. So,
All right, well, thank you so much.